A plant grows without soil, makes its own fertilizer from thin air, and produces more protein per acre than soybeans or eggs. 49 million years ago, this single species covered the Arctic Ocean and pulled so much carbon from the atmosphere that it ended a planetary heat emergency, cooling the entire Earth. For 15 centuries, Asian farmers built temples to honor it and held annual festivals celebrating its power. Today, in the United States, the federal government has classified it as a noxious weed, illegal to transport across state lines. I'm Frank Miller with Heritage Garden Wisdom, and the plant I'm revealing is Azolla, the mosquito fern that once saved a planet and fed civilizations for millennia. The chemical industry discovered something dangerous in the 20th century. This plant could replace everything they were selling. The easiest way to protect profits was to bury the competition. Subscribe to Heritage Garden Wisdom right now if you want to know which plants were deliberately classified as weeds to protect billion-dollar industries. We expose the food sources they need you to forget. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me if you've ever seen this floating fern, or if you want to grow it despite the regulations. By the end of this breakdown, you'll understand exactly why a plant that produces complete nutrition from water and air was branded as a threat requiring eradication. Azolla appears as tiny fronds no larger than a grain of rice clustering together in dense mats that spread across still water surfaces. From a distance, it resembles green velvet or moss covering a pond. Up close, each plant reveals delicate, overlapping leaves arranged like miniature shingles. This is mosquito fern, and hidden within its tissues lives the oldest partnership in the plant kingdom. Nestled inside specialized cavities in every azolla leaf dwells a microscopic organism called Anabaena azolae, a cyanobacterium that has been passing from parent to offspring for over 100 million years. Unlike any other plant symbiosis known to science, this one is inherited directly. The two organisms have co-evolved so completely that neither can survive without the other. Together, they perform a trick that should be impossible. They pull nitrogen directly from the atmosphere and convert it into fertilizer. No soil required, no synthetic inputs, just water, sunlight, and air. The numbers are staggering and reveal why this plant threatens the chemical fertilizer industry. Legumes like soybeans, long celebrated for nitrogen fixation, produce roughly 400 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year. Azolla produces 1,200 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year, nearly 3 times as much. A study published in the Journal of the Science of Food and Agriculture measured protein content at 19 to 30% of dry weight. For comparison, whole eggs contain about 13% protein and soybeans contain about 36% protein. But soybeans require fertile soil, irrigation, and an entire growing season to reach maturity. Azolla doubles its biomass every 2 to 3 days. Under optimal conditions, it can yield 9 tons of protein per hectare per year. No other food source on Earth comes close to this production rate. The protein is highly digestible. Researchers at Penn State University published findings in 2024 confirming that the Carolina strain native to the eastern United States contains significant protein with apparent digestibility of 78%. The plant provides vitamin A, vitamin B12, beta-carotene, iron, calcium, magnesium, and essential amino acids in proportions superior to soybean. Lead researcher Daniel Winstead described it as having a crisp texture and neutral taste. It can be eaten raw in salads, cooked like spinach, or dried and ground into flour. This is a complete food source that requires nothing but water to grow, a fact that makes it incompatible with the business models of chemical agriculture. The historical record of azolla cultivation stretches back over 15 centuries and reveals a plant that once formed the foundation of Asian agricultural prosperity. In 540 CE, a Chinese scholar named Jia Sixie compiled an agricultural encyclopedia called Qimin Yao Shu, Essential Techniques for the Welfare of the People. Among the hundreds of farming methods he documented was a practice already ancient by his time. Rice farmers were growing a floating fern alongside their paddies. When they incorporated this fern into the soil, their rice yields increased dramatically without requiring any other fertilizer. This is the earliest written record of azola cultivation, but the practice itself stretches back thousands of years before written documentation. In northern Vietnam, villages built temples to honor this plant. Wooden idols carved in its likeness stood in shrines where farmers came to pay respect. In the village of Bac Giang, an annual festival celebrated the harvest of what locals called Rao Beao, the floating vegetable. Only a handful of families knew the secret of keeping azola alive through the brutal summer heat. They guarded this knowledge through systems of inheritance, passing cultivation techniques from generation to generation as closely held family secrets. Farmers from distant provinces would travel to these villages each year to purchase starter cultures because their own plants had perished in unfavorable conditions. The knowledge was spreading despite these barriers. By 1973, the Vietnamese government had established over 100 depots to cultivate and distribute azola. 500,000 hectares of rice paddies in northern Vietnam used this living fertilizer. Yields increased by 20% or more compared to unfertilized fields. Before the 1960s, Chinese farmers used azola on over 1,300,000 hectares of rice paddies. The plant provided free nitrogen, suppressed weeds, reduced water evaporation, and improved soil structure. Then, synthetic fertilizers arrived with massive government subsidies, making chemical nitrogen artificially cheap. Agricultural extension programs promoted modern inputs over traditional practices. Within a single generation, azola cultivation collapsed across Asia. The same pattern repeated worldwide, in Vietnam, in India, across Southeast Asia. Traditional knowledge that had sustained civilizations for millennia was abandoned in favor of chemical dependency. By 2020, global nitrogen fertilizer consumption had doubled from 1970 levels. Meanwhile, over half of all applied synthetic nitrogen never reaches the crops it was meant to feed. It leaches into groundwater, contaminating drinking water supplies. It runs off into rivers and oceans, creating dead zones. It volatilizes into the atmosphere as nitrous oxide, a greenhouse gas 300 times more potent than carbon dioxide. The Gulf of Mexico develops a dead zone every summer, an area exceeding 17,000 square kilometers where oxygen levels drop so low that fish and shrimp cannot survive. The cause is nutrient runoff from farms throughout the Mississippi River watershed. Nitrogen and phosphorus from synthetic fertilizers flow downstream, triggering massive algae blooms that deplete oxygen as they decompose. The United Nations has identified these dead zones as one of the most significant environmental threats facing the planet. Some exceed 70,000 square kilometers, and they continue growing. This is the legacy of replacing azola with chemical fertilizers, environmental destruction on a planetary scale. The story of azola extends far beyond human agriculture into planetary climate history, a history that reveals this plant's extraordinary power to reshape Earth's atmosphere. 49 million years ago, during the Middle Eocene epoch, the Arctic Ocean was unrecognizable compared to today. Palm trees lined its shores. Crocodiles swam in warm tropical waters. The global average temperature was 8 degrees Celsius higher than current levels. Atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations had reached 3,500 parts per million, nearly 9 times current levels. The planet was locked in a runaway greenhouse state with no mechanism to cool. Then something extraordinary happened, driven by continental drift. The Arctic Ocean had become almost entirely landlocked as Greenland, Europe, Asia, and North America formed a ring around this enclosed sea. Heavy rainfall carried fresh water from rivers into the basin, creating a thin layer of low salinity water floating on the denser ocean beneath. This freshwater lens, covering 4 million square kilometers, an area larger than India, was all Azolla needed. The fern colonized the Arctic surface and began to spread rapidly, eventually covering the entire basin in floating mats. In 2004, a scientific expedition called the Arctic Coring Expedition sailed to the Lomonosov Ridge near the North Pole. The research vessel Vidar Viking drilled into sediments beneath the Arctic seabed and extracted cores stretching back 80 million years. Scientists aboard made a discovery that rewrote climate history. Layer after layer of the cores contained nothing but fossilized azola remains, 8 meters thick at minimum, perhaps 20 meters or more. The bottom of the deposit was never reached. Scientist Henk Brinkhaus, now director of the Royal Netherlands Institute for Sea Research, examined the samples and found hundreds of thousands of fossils that looked like slimy balls with spaghetti strings sticking out, megaspores perfectly preserved in sediment. The plants had grown on the surface, absorbed carbon dioxide through photosynthesis, died, and carried that carbon to the bottom of the sea permanently, removing it from the atmosphere. The atmospheric record tells the rest of the story. During the Azolla event, carbon dioxide levels plummeted from 3,500 parts per million to 650 parts per million, an 80% reduction. This drawdown triggered a cascade of planetary cooling. Arctic surface water temperatures dropped from 13 degrees Celsius to -9 degrees Celsius. The poles began to freeze. Antarctica developed its first permanent ice sheets. The transition from greenhouse Earth to icehouse Earth had begun, initiated by one tiny floating fern that reshaped the climate of an entire planet. Consider what this means for our current crisis. Today, atmospheric carbon dioxide sits around 420 parts per million and climbing. Scientists estimate that each 1-hectare pond covered in azolla can capture over 21,000 kilograms of carbon dioxide annually. Researchers at the Climate Foundation and universities worldwide are investigating whether azolla could help reverse modern warming. The plant that ended a planetary heat emergency 50 million years ago might have something critical to teach us about the one we face today. The suppression of azolla reveals the economic forces that bury solutions threatening established industries. In 1909, German chemists Fritz Haber and Karl Bosch developed a process for synthesizing ammonia from atmospheric nitrogen. This breakthrough earned Haber the Nobel Prize and changed human civilization forever. Synthetic nitrogen fertilizer enabled the agricultural intensification that fed a rapidly growing global population. It also created a $200 billion industry dependent on fossil fuels and chemical manufacturing. The chemical industry could not allow a free alternative to exist. Examine the regulatory landscape in the United States and the pattern becomes clear. The Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service of the USDA maintains a federal noxious weed list. Among the species classified as threats requiring eradication is Azolla pinnata, the feathered mosquito fern, the same species that Vietnamese farmers honored in temples, the same species that Chinese agricultural texts documented 15 centuries ago, the same species that could replace a significant portion of synthetic nitrogen use. It is now illegal to transport across state lines. The justification for this classification is that azolla can form dense mats that alter aquatic ecosystems. This is true. The plant grows aggressively and can double its coverage in days. It reduces light penetration and changes oxygen dynamics in water bodies. These are legitimate ecological concerns, but consider the framing. A plant that blocks light is labeled invasive and banned, while synthetic fertilizer runoff creates dead zones the size of small countries, and no one classifies that as an ecological threat requiring prohibition. The pattern should look familiar to Heritage Garden Wisdom viewers. White clover was removed from American seed mixes and rebranded as a weed after chemical companies began selling herbicides to kill it. Jerusalem artichoke was marginalized despite outperforming potatoes in yield because it could not be mechanized and monetized. Azolla joined this list of buried abundance, plants that work too well, cost too little, and threaten the profit margins of industries built on scarcity. But Azolla refuses to disappear despite regulatory suppression. In Tamil Nadu, India, the Natural Resources Development Project has spent decades teaching smallholder farmers to cultivate Azolla in backyard ponds. The method is simple. Dig a shallow pit 2 meters by 2 meters, line it with plastic sheeting, add 10 centimeters of water with some soil and a small amount of cow dung for phosphorus, then introduce a starter culture of Azolla. Within 2 weeks, the surface is covered. Harvest daily by scooping excess biomass with a plastic sieve. Feed it fresh to dairy cattle mixed with regular fodder. Milk yields increase 15 to 20% while feed costs drop dramatically. Farmers across India are adopting this practice not because governments recommend it, but because it works economically. In the Ganga River Valley, researchers published findings in 2023 demonstrating that Azolla can replace 1/4 of synthetic urea applications while maintaining or increasing rice yields. Farmers in the study reported lower input costs and greater food security. The knowledge is spreading through Africa just as it once spread through Asia, not through corporate promotion, but through farmer-to-farmer networks sharing what actually works. The future applications of Azolla extend far beyond replacing chemical fertilizers, revealing a plant with potential to solve multiple global challenges simultaneously. In laboratories from Beijing to Boston, scientists are investigating Azolla for applications in closed ecological systems. Chinese researchers have demonstrated that 16 square meters of Azolla cultivation provides enough oxygen for 2 adults in a closed ecological life support system, making it valuable for future space colonization efforts. NASA has studied related species for potential use in space colonies, where growing food without soil becomes essential. Biosphere 2, the famous closed ecosystem experiment in Arizona, used Azolla as a protein source for fish and poultry within their self-contained environment. The plant that grew without soil on a distant planet 50 million years ago might help us colonize others in the future. The question confronting us is not whether Azolla works. 15 centuries of documented agricultural use prove conclusively that it works. The question is not whether it is safe for consumption. Billions of people across Asia have consumed it directly or eaten animals raised on it without adverse effects. The question is not whether modern science validates traditional knowledge. Peer-reviewed studies in respected journals confirm everything farmers knew all along about its nutritional and agricultural value. The question is simply this: who benefits when free resources are classified as threats? Consider a world where every farm pond produces its own nitrogen fertilizer, where smallholder farmers no longer depend on volatile global commodity markets for agricultural inputs, where protein grows on water and air with minimal environmental footprint, where the dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico begin to shrink because nitrogen no longer pours off agricultural fields in toxic runoff. This is not fantasy or utopian speculation. This is what Azolla offers as a practical, proven solution. This is what they buried through regulatory classification and economic suppression. The plant is still out there, floating on ponds and ditches across 6 continents, doubling every few days, making protein from nothing, fixing nitrogen from air, waiting for someone to remember what it offers. 49 million years ago, it cooled a burning planet. 1,500 years ago, it fed civilizations sustainably. Today, it sits on a government list of noxious weeds requiring eradication. The question is whether you will believe the label they gave it, or whether you will investigate it anyway and discover what they spent a century teaching you to forget. If this breakdown from Heritage Garden Wisdom revealed the plant that threatens billion-dollar industries, subscribe right now because we're exposing more solutions that were buried to protect corporate profits. Share this with people who need to understand why free abundance is classified as a threat. Drop a comment telling me if you think Azolla should be removed from the noxious weed list. I want to know who understands what's really being suppressed. I'm Frank Miller, and this is Heritage Garden Wisdom, where we recover the solutions they tried to erase from history. The vault is open. The question is whether you'll grow what they forbid.